We are just going to stay here and finish closing remarks here. We don't have to get off and get back on. Does that sound like a plan, Tam?
Yeah.
Cool.
Uh,
All right.
I just had one question. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it
Yeah.
is.
All right, just want to confirm. All right.
Okay. So I'll start with so Michael Jenkins is we've been running now for about 2 years now. We met in Bit. I started our Slack and we were like, hey, I look at men as allies. So anybody that ever listens to this recording and wonder like, how do I view men or whatever, or why do we have men talking at a women in Linux conference or a women's conference? It's because I view men as allies. If you're going into tech, if you know anything about what's going on in tech, you know that you're probably going to work with a man. Sorry, that's just what happens. So I feel also that you need those allies in the community, whether they're man, woman, whatever gender, whatever color, whatever race, whatever. You just need someone that's willing to, ride that out with you, who's willing to give you a different voice. So Michael Jenkins has been that person for me and for the community as well. I try to bounce ideas off of him. I try to bounce ideas off of everyone. He's been very supportive. We talk about DevOps, and I don't talk about as much coding as they do in Bit, but in my group, I talk about presentations, getting your talks out there. I look at this as the platform for you to do that. And so Michael Jenkins has taken that opportunity to make sure he shares his knowledge with you and also shares his knowledge with the community as a whole. So I give you Michael Jenkins.
Thank you so much, Tamika, for that introduction. It is an honor to be an ally, and I mean, I guess a little bit selfish in my interest because I have two daughters that are also interested in technology, and they're also part of this up and coming workforce that's going to be contributing to our society. So I want to do what I can. I want to be an active participant in making sure that their opportunities are you know. Uh, enabled as well. So thank you again for having me. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in to my talk, and I just want to start with a couple scenarios before we get into the meat of the material. So let's just say you're a web developer and you're coding some type of application, and with each change you want to run tests on every modern web browser and maybe even on some mobile platforms. You're really good at making websites, but once you get into testing, it's kind of tough to get that environment up and running, and actually running those tests take time away from adding new features to your to your application. Or maybe let's say you're an avid scripter and you're programming in Bash, Python, Perl. You're automating tasks. You're using scripts to do things that would take lots of time to do manually. But what if there's this task that you have to do it every day, you're running the script each time, you're checking the results, and then you're taking whatever action needs to be taken when that task is complete. It's definitely something that you can handle, but you've got other stuff that's more important to worry about. Maybe it's a higher priority, and getting to that script running task is just kind of becoming a chore. Or let's say you're a system administrator and you're in charge of dozens of servers, and you need to connect to each one of them and run a command or get some information on a regular basis, maybe daily, weekly, even hourly. You could probably script it up and you could probably even make it run as a cron job. But what happens if that cron job fails or something goes offline? Or what if you need to change something and then you have to connect to all of these systems and make this one small change? How do you manage that? How do you check the status of everything and to make sure it's running as it's planned? Well, what if there was some sort of automation framework that could help you with each of these scenarios? So what I'd like to do is introduce you to Jenkins, your automation butler. He's going to help you with each of these scenarios and more. But before I get into what Jenkins can do for you, let me introduce myself. So as Tamika mentioned, my name is Michael Jenkins. A little bit about my background. I have a BS and MS in computer engineering from Iowa State University, go Clones. And for the past 20 years or so, I've been working in system administration and process automation. And I've been using Jenkins for several years in various industries. It started out about 5 years ago at Toyota, where we used Jenkins to manage the infrastructure that hosted Toyota's websites, toyota.com, Scion.com, and lexus.com. And presently, I'm at the Walt Disney Company, where I work in business intelligence operations. And our primary use of Jenkins there, at least for my team, is to run jobs that do ETL or extract, transfer, and load of data for big data analysis. So let's talk a little bit more about what we're going to talk about today. First of all, I kind of want to tell you what is Jenkins. I'll give you a little bit of background on the tool, and then also give you some ideas of maybe why you should use Jenkins depending on what you need to do for your automation needs. And then we'll get into some demos and I'll show you how you can actually use Jenkins. If we've got some time, we'll go into some advanced concepts that I might not touch on in these other bullet points here. So Jenkins, what is it? Well, Jenkins is basically an automation server, and by definition, the authors of the tool say that it can be used to support building, deploying, and automating any project. And they like to emphasize automating any project. And I mean, that's possible because of the environment that Jenkins has, or I should say the ecosystem that Jenkins has grown into as a community. So I like to say that Jenkins is your automation butler. So basically, you develop the plan and the jobs, and Jenkins manages them. So you do have to put in some work into, getting your automation set up and getting everything in place the way that you want it to. But Jenkins kind of takes care of all the heavy lifting around that automation, like compiling code, deploying an artifact to a production server, monitoring some application, or maybe taking action if an application is not operating the way it's expected, or maybe even generating reports when the jobs are done and emailing them to you. So why should you use Jenkins? I mean, I just mentioned some of these, some of the reasons why, but after all, there are other automation servers out there, right? And we could talk about that a little bit later, but let's talk about some of the reasons why you might want to use Jenkins, though. First of all, Jenkins is free software. In comparison to some of the other applications that you could use out there for automation, Jenkins is completely free to use. You can host it on premises. You could host it on the cloud. There are no licensing obligations whatever as far as your use for using Jenkins. Also, as I mentioned, there's an active community and ecosystem around Jenkins. Well, first of all, it's the #1 application being used today. And along with that, there are conferences. Jenkins World is probably the biggest one. There are user groups that meet all over the world. And with that community, there are a lot of experienced developers and admins that know how to kind of hit the ground running with Jenkins as an application. So even if, say, you're a manager or some type of team lead and you want to find somebody that has Jenkins experience, given the large community of Jenkins users, you could probably find somebody that has that experience. There's also books on Jenkins and training materials readily available, whereas some of the newer tools may not have that a kind of infrastructure built in for them as far as conferences, experienced users, and books or training. And also, Jenkins is pluggable and extendable. There are thousands of plugins that you can use for Jenkins. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But basically, if you find that there's something that you can't do with Jenkins, then you could probably develop a plugin yourself to make that happen. So you can take the tool, use it as a framework, and extend it for that job that you need to do. So basically, I like to say that Jenkins is strong enough to handle just about any job that you can throw at it. I say Jenkins does the heavy lifting. Well, yeah, he'll be able to handle that. So now let's talk a little bit about how do I use Jenkins, or how you might use it. Well, first of all, you got to install it and start creating jobs. And let's see here. Yeah. So yeah, we'll just get into this, installing it and starting to create jobs. So when you think about installing Jenkins, you might think, well, what about my environment? My environment is very unique as far as the operating system or whatever the case is. I run Windows, I run CentOS, whatever the case is. Well, there are installers for just about every major operating system. So you don't have to compile it from source. You don't have to do anything crazy to get it up and running on your systems. You just have to go to jenkins.io/download and download the correct installer for your system, and you could get it up and running pretty quickly that way. There are also ways to install it with package managers like apt-get and yum, depending on the flavor of your Linux, where you can just say yum install Jenkins, and the installation just kind of happens magically for you that way. There are also, if you're going to run Jenkins in the cloud, there are automated installs from cloud providers as well. So Azure kind of has their package Jenkins, AWS has one as well. I believe that one's provided by Bitnami, and Google also has a Bitnami-backed Jenkins install that you can run with just a couple clicks. Kind of the cool thing about running on a cloud provider is that usually they build the security in for you so that profiles or permissions and everything are kind of built into the server or to the accounts that have access to the Jenkins server that you would spin up using their install methods. One of my favorite ways, though, to run Jenkins is to run Jenkins on Docker. And you might say, well, why would you want to run Jenkins on Docker? Well, in my opinion, it's the fastest way to get the latest version of Jenkins installed locally. I usually run on a Mac these days, and there are definitely installers for Mac. You can do a homebrew install Jenkins. You can download the installer from jenkins.io/downloads. But using a Docker container, I can get a clean, fresh install of Jenkins in probably about 5 minutes or less. And with that, I don't have too much commitment to it. I mean, after all, it's a Docker container. So when I'm done with running whatever tests or things that I need to do, then I can just let that instance go or that Docker container go, and I'm not out for anything. And with that, it's perfect for testing and exploration. So if you want to learn something with Jenkins really quickly and maybe just explore it before you implement it on a production instance, or maybe your locally installed instance, or permanently locally installed instance, and I'll kind of talk about that here in a little bit, then you could spin up a Jenkins in a Docker container, maybe test out a plugin or run some script or whatever the case is, and you won't have to worry about breaking anything in your permanent install or kind of dirtying up or muddying up your environment with something that you have to try and roll back if it doesn't work out for you the way that you expected it to. However, I will say that running Jenkins in Docker container is not ideal for production. It's not impossible. It can be done, but the way that I use it, it's definitely not ideal due to the fact that you would want persistent data in your production Jenkins instance, and you would also want some different permissions or authentication methods built in. So again, it's not impossible, but for learning and just kind of working with Jenkins to do some quick things, definitely use in Docker that way, but don't think that you can just jump to production and use it the same way. So when we install Jenkins on Docker, it's pretty easy. Well, first of all, you have to have Docker installed on your system. I'm not going to go into that in this particular talk, but I do have some documentation or some links in the resources at the end of this presentation where you can find links to get installers to get Docker up and running on your system. Windows or Mac, either one, you can run Docker there, no problem. But after you get Docker installed, then really there's just two commands that you need to run. You run a Docker run command and then a Docker exec command. And I'll give you a little bit of background on these. This first command, Docker run, what it'll do is, first of all, download the Jenkins image if it's not already present on your system. If it is already present on your system, it'll look to see if it's out of date. And by out of date, I mean that the folks who develop Jenkins, they publish new versions of the Jenkins image pretty much weekly. So if you have, say, done this Docker run command last week and there's a new version, The next time you run it, Docker will download that latest version for you. The next switch, detach, just tells Docker to run this in the background so that it doesn't hog up your terminal that you're running it in, and you're able to get back to your terminal to run additional commands. The publish switch here will tell Jenkins which, or I'm sorry, it tells Docker which ports to connect from your local host to the Jenkins instance. Jenkins runs in a Tomcat, well, Jetty or Tomcat container, which is typically run on port 8080. And so we're going to connect our localhost port, in this case 49,000, to the Jenkins instance, which will be running or listening to port 8080. The dash name switch, Jenkins, really just names this container that we're about to run. And then the last Jenkins is for the actual image that we're going to download. Jenkins is actually what they call a library image for the Docker Hub ecosystem. So we don't have to specify a provider and then the image. We can just say, hey, I want Jenkins, and Docker knows that it's one of the default images and just kind of grabs it that way. The way that Jenkins comes up when it first starts is that you need to enter an initial admin password, and that's kind of to protect the installation from somebody just connecting to it and being able to log in right away, because it used to be in older versions of Jenkins that it would come up insecure, meaning that anybody could just log in, create an account, and I believe the first account that logs in was actually given admin privileges by default. So this kind of prevents that from happening. And basically what this does, this docker exec command allows us to get that initial admin password, and then we can go into our newly spun up instance and create our accounts. So with all that said, let's get into a demo of installing Jenkins with Docker. If you're going to follow along with this demo, maybe now or later on if you're watching a replay of this session, you do need to be online, primarily for the initial download of the Jenkins Docker image and for any plugins that are installed during the Jenkins installation. So let's go to our terminal and get started. Can everybody see my screen okay? Just want to make sure I haven't done anything crazy here as I switch over to my terminal. Let's see, we're going to do docker run -- detach, and we're going to publish on port 49,000 locally. We're going to go 8080 on the Jenkins instance. We're going to name it Jenkins, and then we're going to download the Jenkins image. Now, I'm not sure if I have the Jenkins image locally, so this will probably start a download or a pull. And sure enough, Docker says, hey, you don't have the latest one locally, so let's pull it down. And in this case, it's going to download everything. And after it does the download, it's going to do an install for me. And so we'll let that run. And I will say, again, as I mentioned, by having an image locally, it's really easy to spin this up, because the next time I run, I already have that image, and this download will either not take place, or it will just be an update to whatever part of the image has changed, and then I'll be able to spin it up pretty quickly. Okay, so I see one command or one question in the chat while we're waiting for this to download. The question saying that when it's possible to run in Docker in production, does it mean that it can be made to be persistent in some way? Yes, it can be made to be persistent. Specifically, you would use a volume so that your data for the Jenkins container is written to the local system, the Docker host. So that way, if that container restarts or reboots or gets deleted and has to come back or whatever the case is, then you will be able to recover. In this case, the way that I'm running it, I'm running a clean install every time. So every time I have to do the initial admin password, every time I have to create accounts, and so on. So we got our image. It's up and running. If I do a docker ps, let me get in here, docker ps, I can see there is my instance running. So now what I need to do is a docker exec on this instance. And the command that we're going to run, Docker exec IT Jenkins, and the command I want to run is cat var lib. Let's see if I can remember this one. Var lib Jenkins. I think it is secrets, and then it's initial admin password. Camel case. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted to do. I don't want to IT. I don't want to. I just want this command, one command to run and finish. Oh, you know what? I forgot my quotes. Let's see. No such file or directory. Let me go back to the presentation because I forgot what that path is. Jenkins var Jenkins home. There we go. Var Jenkins underscore home. And was it var Jenkins home? It is secrets. And no such file or directory. Let me copy it out of there. And actually, you know what? I'm kidding myself because I actually have a, and Tamika probably knows me better. I actually have a script called Jenkins on Docker that does this for me because I always forget what this stuff is. And I will share that with you all a little bit later. But what it'll do is basically everything that I just typed, it just will do it for me. It checks to see if any, if I have one running. If it does, it will stop it, it'll delete it, and then it'll just wait for Jenkins to start up, which it's going to do now. And then when it finishes, it will kick out the initial admin password automatically, so I don't have to do that cat step. And then it will also give me a link that I can just click on and go to my browser to get to it. So really, I'm kidding myself because, I mean, I'm really a fan of automation. So I didn't want to cheat you all for this experience. I want to show you, you know, the actual steps that go on in the background. But really, if it's a command that you're going to be typing a lot, then go ahead and automate that. That's what we're here talking about today. So I'm going to copy this admin password, and then I'm going to go to my browser. I've already got a shortcut here for my local host on 49,000, and I get this first screen which asks me to unlock Jenkins, and it gives me the path right there. I should have just opened that up. I paste in the initial admin password here, and then click continue. Okay, the next screen that we're going to get asks us to customize Jenkins. Now, historically, when we would install Jenkins or do a Jenkins install, it would come up just like bare bones. There would be no plugins installed, and for every instance, we would have to go through and pick out, you know, some of these plugins that we use all the time. So what the developers of Jenkins did was say, hey, let's pull these best of breed, you know, these core plugins that everybody seems to use, and we'll just call these suggested plugins, so that when people do an install, then we can just, you know, install these for them by default. So that's what they've done here. They give us an option to click. It just says install suggested plugins. We can also go through and customize this install if we go to select plugins to install, but I'm just going to go ahead and install the suggested plugins. And so what it does here, we can see a list of all these default plugins that it's going to install, and it just goes through, it's going to download and install each one of these. Okay, another question that we had in the chat says, is there a free version of Jenkins for the home user who wants to play with it and explore it? Explore what it can do? Yes, as I mentioned earlier, Jenkins is open source and free to use. You can use it pretty much however you want to. And as somebody else mentioned in the chat, yes, there are some premium options. For instance, CloudBees is the company that pretty much supports Jenkins from an industry standpoint, and they do have some premium offerings that you would have to buy licenses for. They actually have a separate version of Jenkins that they take as open source and customize for their enterprise customers. It has some pretty neat features in it as far as built-in high availability, managing multiple Jenkins installations from one particular console, and that type of thing. You can do that yourself, in the regular old Jenkins installation, but it's going to take, some work on your behalf, and they've kind of taken care of all that for you. Let me see if there's any other questions I missed. This does take a second or two, depending on your connection or download speed. And since I've got GoToMeeting running right now and some other applications, it's probably taken a second.
So, Mike, one of the other questions is, how do you use Jenkins in your environment?
Yeah, my primary use for Jenkins, as I mentioned, I work in business intelligence operations, and one of the main thing that we do is move data from one place to another. So ETL jobs are a big part of the way that I use Jenkins day to day, and we set up jobs that pull down data from Google Cloud and store it locally in a Hadoop file system. And then we have other jobs that read data from that Hadoop file system and then push it back up to Google. We also have pipeline servers, Jenkins deployment servers, that will build applications for us and then push them to Google Cloud. And so that's more of a sort of a continuous integration type step. And that's just another way that you can get Jenkins to kind of automate things for you. Because of course you can compile your application locally, run tests, and then upload it yourself. But if you're doing it continuously, you want sort of an automation framework that can do it for you. Okay, so it looks like our plugins have been installed successfully, and now we get the screen where we can create our first admin user. Now there's a couple different things that you can do here. Down here at the bottom of the screen, you can just continue as admin. If you continue as admin, it doesn't create any users at all. And if this session gets locked out, you would have to log in as admin with that initial admin password. So what I like to do is just create a fake user with the password. The password is me. Full name is me. Everything's just me, just to make it really easy to remember what the password is. However, for this step, the email address, it will check to see if your email address is valid. So I just say, I'll just give it a fake email address, me@me.com, and we'll save it, finish. Jenkins is now ready, and we can start using Jenkins. Now this is the interface that we'll get when we start using Jenkins, and the main button we see here is create new jobs. So let me go back to the presentation for a second to see if I have anything I need to refer to here. We've kind of gone through the demo, installing Jenkins with Docker. Now let's get into creating and running jobs. But first you might ask a question like, what is a job? I've been saying this through the presentation, and then we're even seeing it in the GUI here, create new jobs. Well, what is this job that they're talking about? Well, a job is basically a collection of parameters and commands that tell Jenkins what to do. So we're going to use this kind of job template, if you will, to fill in like the name of the job, maybe describe it, tell Jenkins where to run the job in terms of what servers to run it on, how often to run the job, maybe set up some environment variables that need to be checked before the job runs, and then actually outline the steps that we want Jenkins to take as far as running this process. So what I'm going to do now is basically go through a series of demos here, doing some jobs with Jenkins here. So let me get back to the Jenkins console. All right, so I mean, the first thing that everybody does when they're working on any new application, programming language, or whatever the case it is they got to do a hello world, right? So let's get started with creating a new job. And if you want to, they're welcoming you here. You want to create new jobs, you can click here to create your first job. Any other time, you would use this link over here where it says new items. You would click that one. So I'm going to just click create new jobs, and we get this interface. So it's definitely required. You got to give your job a name. So we're going to call it Hello Jenkins. And there are different types of jobs that we can create. The first one here, freestyle project, pipelines, external jobs, and so on. I'm not going to get into all of these right now, but what I would like to focus on is the freestyle project. This is pretty much a bare bones template, if you will, for a job that you can customize to do, very specific things to your needs. So some of these other types of jobs kind of assume things for you, and they're usually assumed correctly, but for the freestyle project, you can get in there and customize everything exactly the way that you want it. So we're going to click freestyle project and then click OK. And now we get into the job, what I'll just call the job template. And as I mentioned, we get the name, we can get a description. We're just going to say saying hello. And then we get some other options here as far as what we want to do with this build, source code management, build triggers, build environment, the build itself, and then some post-build actions. Before we get into all of those, I just want to point out over here on the right side these question marks. One of the cool things about the Jenkins interface is that it has built-in help. So if you're looking at this template and you see this option that says discard old builds, you're like, what the heck are they talking about, discard old builds? Well, you can just click this question mark here and they'll tell you exactly what it means right here in context with the option that you're looking at. So in this case, discard old builds tells us when, if ever, to get rid of this particular record of builds that Jenkins keeps for you. So and one of the things I mentioned as far as running cron jobs, that type of thing, usually if you're running some automated process on a script on a system through a cron job or some other process that kind of kicks it off, you don't get a log or a very easily consumed log of the previous runs that have gone through with that script. But Jenkins really automates or really simplifies that process by keeping your builds for you. So that's just one way. I'm not going to go through each of these options because we'd be here for much longer than I might have time for. But what I'm going to go down here for just this really basic hello world is get into this particular step or this section right here called the build section. This is probably the most important section of the job template, because this is where you tell Jenkins exactly what you want it to do. All these other parameters just kind of tell it how to handle other parts of doing what it does, but this is where you actually tell it what to do. So in this case, you click this menu button, add build step, and you see you get some options here. If you're running on a Windows system, you can execute a Windows batch command, execute shell, which is kind of like running a generic shell. You can invoke Ant or Gradle if you're building things that have Ant or Gradle dependencies. Also Maven. A little bit of background for these, why these are so prominent. Jenkins was initially developed to do Java builds or builds for Java applications. So it has a lot of good tie-ins for Ant, Gradle, and Maven, which are tools to automate Java builds. We can also run with a timeout, which means we can tell Jenkins to run for so long and then time out if the build gets stuck or something. And then this last one is we can set build status depending on GitHub commit. And I'll get into using Git with Jenkins here in a little bit. But in this case, we're just going to execute a shell, and as you might expect, as a simple hello world problem or solution would be, we're just going to say hello Jenkins. Okay. Couple options here after we have defined our build step. Then we get two buttons here at the bottom, save and apply. You might wonder why there's not just a save button, there's this apply button, and I'll explain the differences. The apply button does a save, but it keeps you in the job template. So if I click apply, you'll see up the top it says, hey, we saved your job description, your job template, and I'm still here, so I can still make changes if I wanted to. I can come here and say hello again. and then I can apply it and save it and so on. If I save it, it will take me out of the job and take me to basically the project page, or the top page for the job. So I'll click save, and now I'm here. And I should say also, you see the project here. Project and job are pretty much synonymous in Jenkins. So if you hear somebody say project, or if you hear somebody say job, they're probably talking about the same thing in terms of this unit of execution in Jenkins. So over here on the side of this project page, job page, we have a couple options here. We can go back to the dashboard, which will take us back to the Jenkins homepage. We can check the status of the build, and I'll get to that here in a second. If we are using source control, we can see changes that have been made in it. The workspace is the directory where the job actually runs. So if we have any artifacts left over, or any files that we want to see in the workspace, or the actual directory where Jenkins ran, we can look there. Build now, which is probably the most important option for us at this point, because we actually want to run this job. We can also delete it, or we can configure it, which will take us back to the template screen where we can make changes. So let's go ahead and click build. And as we see the build, we got this little pop-up that said the build was scheduled. We can look at the build history, and each build is numbered sequentially from 1 going up. And we can see that we have a success. You'll see the blue ball for success. You will see a red ball for a failure. And because Jenkins is so customizable, a lot of people say, well, hey, I'm more used to seeing green for success. So they actually have a plugin that can change the success ball to green instead of blue, if that's your preference. So let's click the success ball and check out the console output. So here we get some history, or some metadata on this job run. We can see that it was started by me. It tells us where it ran in this workspace directory here. When your job runs, it creates a script to run the job in the temp directory. So this is the actual script that it ran. These get removed after the job has completed. And by default, the way that it's set up, it echoes your command before it actually runs. And so here's our output of that command, and the same thing for this one. And then it tells us it finished with success. So one of the things I mentioned was the status. Let me run this a couple of times here. Okay, so I run that a couple of times. And now we can go to our status. Actually, I want to go to trend. So one of the things that's cool about the reporting that Jenkins gives you is that it will, first of all, it'll tell you, given this kind of pretty cool view that scrolls from side to side here, when your jobs have run on this timeline. So if you have multiple jobs, you want to see when they've run, on what days or whatever, depending on how much history you saved, how many jobs you saved, you can scroll back and forward in time. The top scroller scrolls a little bit faster, as you can see. The bottom one just scrolls on an hourly basis. And we can see each of these jobs that we've run. We also get this really nice graph here that tells us, okay, on this particular build, this is how long it ran. You can see the first build was probably our fastest. I don't know why these were running slower. But, and also, kind of a graph here of these jobs that have run. If these jobs failed, and I'll show you a failure in a second, then we'll see something a little bit different here in the trend. So let's go back to our project. And we're going to make it fail. How do you make it fail, you would say? Well, by default, Jenkins will look for any exit code that is not 0. And if it's not 0, then it will exit the build, or exit the build step as a failure. So if I just say exit 1 or exit 99 or whatever the case, that value is not 0, so it's going to cause this job to fail. So let's save that. And let's build it. And let's see what happens. Build that a couple times. And so we see our failures here. Let's take a look at one of those. And of course, we exited with the value that wasn't 0, so we got the build step as failure. So let's go back to the project here and look at our trend. And now we can see we got a little bit different highlighting here for these jobs. Now they're kind of red, kind of flagged that way. And also in our build time trend, we can see the red ball here for failure. And then we also see in our graph here that part of our trend graph has actually turned red. So another thing I want to show, we're just in the hello world stage, is this little icon here. I thought this was pretty cute when I first started using Jenkins, in that it gives you kind of this weather symbol to let you know how your build is running historically. So if you see a sunshine, and I should have showed you that before, we'll see if we can get back to it, then you know that your build is good historically. But in this case, we got some clouds and maybe a little rain here, and they're saying that our 3 out of our last 5 builds have failed. So that's kind of bad weather, right? If you get even more than that, then you'll see lightning bolts come out of here, and it'll be a pretty dreary, dark day here. But as your build comes back to being more stable, then you'll get partly cloudy, and then it'll come back to sunny and that type of thing. So that's kind of neat. We'll just build this a couple more times to see if we can change the weather a little bit. All right, let's go back to the dashboard. And hey, we're back sunny again. So no recent builds have failed. Let's look at our trend here, and we see that, yeah, sure enough, we got some of these that have failed, but we also have the most recent one pass. And in our graph, we can see that, hey, we're back into a state that's pretty good. Just as you're playing around with this GUI, you can see, well, hey, I can only see down so low. If you grab this little bar right here, you can pull this down so you can see more detail here. Okay, are there any questions here? Let me see in the chat. I don't see any questions, so I'm going to go on to the next demo, where I mentioned that we could run this or run jobs on a like on a regular basis. So let's create a new item. We're going to call this a cron-based job, and we're going to make a freestyle project. And let's start here, and we'll just describe it running on a schedule. Now, one of the options that we get here is that we can build periodically. So I'm going to click that, and you see we get this field here that says no schedules, so nothing's going to run because I don't have a schedule yet. And this field is pretty cool because it takes the exact same input as you might expect for a cron job. So if you're familiar with the way to schedule your cron jobs, as far as the minute, the hour, the day, the week, the month, I forget exactly how that all lays out, then that exact format is going to be used here. Again, we have our context sensitive help here, so we can click that to get a little bit more information on how that format goes and how we can enter it there. One of the cool things, though, that I really like about Jenkins is that it gives you some shortcuts. So let's see if I can find them here. I can type them in if they're not here. It's a lot of time zones, right? Well, I'm not going to scroll all the way down here and find them. But one of the shortcuts that Jenkins gives you is this hourly. You can type that. You can type weekly. You can type monthly, and so on, so that you don't even have to specify the whole star space star, et cetera, et cetera. It'll just do it for you. Another option that you can use is this H variable, and basically what H will do, you can see here, it's kind of like a hash, and they say you should use that whenever possible, because what Jenkins will do when it sees that H is it will try to space your job out in relation to other jobs, but still be true to the schedule that you set. So in this particular case, I want to run this job, say, every other minute or so. So I'm going to do star, or hash it 2, and then 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Is that enough? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so we're good. And now, after we get a valid schedule in here, it gives us kind of this definition. It says it would have last run at this time, and the next run is going to be at 8:23 p.m. UTC. So, and what all I'm going to do here for this particular build step is we're going to echo, or actually let's do date plus %f. Let's just do, yeah, we'll do that for now. Actually, we'll just do the date so we can see the whole thing. All right, let's save that. And even though I set it up to build on a schedule, I can still build it manually if I want to. So let's just kick it off a couple times. And we can check our output here. We're getting our date. So what I'm going to do is just kind of let this one go and let it run a couple times here. And actually, even just to get it run a little bit faster, I'm just going to say run every minute. So now we're going to get that to run. Okay, so while that's running, I'm going to go and start another item, and I'm going to say, no, we're going to say get based job. We're also going to go with a freestyle project for this one, and we're going to say okay. So one of the things that I mentioned is that we can use Git, or we can allow, excuse me, Jenkins to be aware of things that we've saved in Git, and ask Jenkins, hey, I've got this code over here on GitHub or wherever my repository is. I want you to check out code from there and use that for my build step, as opposed to typing it into the shell directly. And there's some pros and cons with this. One of the benefits of doing it that way is that in your repo, of course, you have revision history so that you can track changes to your scripts that way. And as opposed to, not having being able to do anything in sort of a history here, because you can make changes to a build step and Jenkins doesn't track those changes for you. So if somebody comes in and makes some changes, you don't really know from the last time that you edited what changes have been made. So it's kind of difficult to keep track of changes that way. But to do that, and I've got this handy dandy repo here. We've got some scripts in here. We've got our hello and our fail script. I should have had another one here that's not a fail job, but no, we'll use the hello. That's fine. So what I want to do now is I want to go to the source code management section, and we're going to select Git. So basically all you have to give it is this URL. Say, hey, here's the repo URL. There are no credentials that we need. If you wanted to add credentials, you can. You can add passwords, you can add keys, and so on to give Jenkins permission or credentials to access your repo, however it may exist. We're going to be reading from the master. You can also specify different branches. If, say, for instance, you want Jenkins to listen on or look for changes in, say, your test branch, and pull code from tests before you do anything on the master branch, then you can do that. And we're just going to leave all the rest of this as default. But what this is going to do is Jenkins is going to check out this code into our work environment. So we already know that there's a script in there called hello. So what we're going to do is I'm going to execute a build step, and I'm going to actually run a shell this time. User bin -xe, and then I'm just going to source, if I can spell it right, source hello.sh. So let me back up a little bit. What I'm doing now is giving Jenkins a shebang command. I'm basically telling it which interpreter to use to run all of the steps that would come after this command. So I want to run this script using bash. And using -x-e, the -x will give me that echo feature. So every command that gets run is going to echo it out. And then that e command tells the bash interpreter to exit on any return code that is not 0. And then all I'm going to do is source my hello.sh script. All right, let's save that. And you can kind of see how this is different. Before, when I was actually typing the commands in the shell, I was saying, you know, echo hello or echo this, et cetera, and you know, in this case, I'm just sourcing a script that has those commands in it. So let's apply that, or rather, let's save it, and let's run this. Build it a couple times just so we get a little bit of history. And let's go to our output. So now we can see here that some of the steps that Jenkins has taken to get ready. It looked here, it started building in the workspace. It started fetching changes from our repo, checked it out and everything, checked the version of Git, looked for any tags and everything. And actually it actually gives me my last commit message here to show the last change that I made. And then it actually executes the script. We get 2 echoes here, or 2 pluses here, because I want to say in the script I might actually have another call to a bash interpreter. But we finally get our echo that says hello Jenkins, smiley face, and there we go. So just to kind of make this example full circle, let's go and make a change to our hello script. So in this case, I'm not even working in the Jenkins environment. I'm working in my terminal, just as I might normally work every day, and I want to make a change to the hello script. So what if we want to say echo, or let's say today, or no, let's do this, echo today, and make sure I don't have any errors in here. Today is date. And then we'll just say, nice to meet you, just to get some other stuff on here. Okay, and so now I can say I want to, or I added, or add the date and more stuff. So we're going to check that into GitHub, and we can even go to GitHub, and if we wanted to confirm that our changes are there. Again, I haven't touched anything in Jenkins yet, but let's go back to the project. Let's build it again. And let's look at that output. So now we can see that, where is my, here's my commit message. After it did this checkout, it says, hey, I added the date and more stuff. And then we run our script and we get the things that we added. Today is whatever, nice to meet you, etc. So this is kind of a contrived example to show how you can use GitHub or a Git repo as a base for your scripts that run in Jenkins. And if we go back to the project here, oh, this is what I want to go to changes. So another cool thing, if you actually come to the job, you can see kind of a history here of what changes were made. You even get the commit hash, a link to it, and the script that was or the files that were changed. You can do a diff on it. You see who made the change and so on. So if this user was tied to a user in this Jenkins environment, then you can get information on that user. So as you can see, using a GitHub repo to host the code that you actually run in your jobs in Jenkins is very, very useful for tracking changes and kind of managing your environment that way. So while we've been going through that demo, you might recall that we did our cron job demo, our cron-based demo, and it ran. Looks like it's run a couple times now. Let's go check this out. Let's go back to the project. Oops, I went too far. Cron-based. So it's running every minute now. Let's look at the trend here. Trend is looking pretty good. And that, again, that's just an example of how we can schedule jobs on Jenkins using that cron trigger, what they call a cron-based trigger. And actually, if I go into a job, look at the console, you can actually see that it was started by a timer. Now you might recall some of the other jobs, it actually showed who started the job. It said started by me because that's the user I'm logged in as. In this case, it's saying it was started by a timer. There are also ways that you can kick off other jobs within a job. And in this case, it would say started by and the job name. So you can kind of trace it back that way. All right, let's go back to the top here. Tamika, how am I doing on time? Just want to check in with you, make sure I don't go over or under.
I think we got you slotted for five. I mean, not 5:45. I think we end at 4:45.
Okay.
So
Okay. So
I
we got a
think
few
you
more
kind of got,
minutes.
yeah, you got, I guess, 5 minutes for questions.
Okay, let me do while we pick up some more questions. I did want to get into one other example. Let's see if I got some time to it. Some of the advanced topics: continuous integration, delivery, and deployment. I purposefully didn't get too far into this topic because, I mean, I could probably spend a couple hours just talking about these concepts, let alone how Jenkins can lend itself to, support each and every one of these particular steps. But I did want to talk a little bit about it. I guess if people aren't familiar with those, continuous integration is basically just compiling your code all the time. As people are making changes and checking them in, the project is compiled. Delivery means that the project is actually being built, so that as code is being checked in, it's being tested, and it's being compiled into the finished product. And then by deployment, then we would actually take that finished product, an artifact or a website or whatever the case is, and actually put it into production. And Jenkins is very useful at each one of those steps. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail of that because it would take a lot of time, but I just kind of wanted to touch on that topic as well. And then I also want to talk about pipelines really quickly. And I do have an example of using a pipeline. So I want to go back to my browser here, and within this repo, this Jenkins demo repo, I have what's called a Jenkins file. And Jenkins file, you might be familiar with Docker file or Makefile, and how it's kind of a domain-specific definition for an application. Well, Jenkins has the Jenkins file, which really describes how a job operates within a Jenkins project. So in this case, I'm defining a pipeline, and I'm not going to go into each of these steps, but basically I'm defining each option that's going to happen in this pipeline. And I use the term pipeline to kind of describe the process of taking some sort of code or some sort of input, doing some operations on that, and then moving it to the next stage, and then moving it to the next stage. So the one example that I gave earlier at the beginning of the talk was, say you're an application developer and you want to test your web app on different operating systems. Well, let's see a really quick example on how we can do that in Jenkins. In this case, I am going to select the pipeline project as opposed to the freestyle project. And then I'm going to say OK. And one of the cool things about this here is there, as you can see, it looks a little bit different. We still get pretty much the same sort of interface that we got for a freestyle project, but we get this section here where it just says pipeline, and we can define where we get our pipeline from. So pretty much doing a freestyle project, we can type our pipeline in here. They also have some sample pipelines that you can kind of play around with if you want to get started. There's a good old Hello World one. But what I'm going to do is grab my pipeline script from a source control management system, and I'm going to select Git, and pretty similar to the last way we used that, it wants the repo URL. This is open, and it also checks. I don't know, like if I do something crazy here, if I say I want you to get it from that one, it'll say, hey, that's not a valid repo. What's going on? So let me make sure it's correct. And it is correct. We don't need any credentials for that, so I won't define any. We do want to build from master. And within my project, I can define where the Jenkins file is. Typically, you want to keep it right at the top of your repository, and that's where it is. By default, that's where Jenkins is going to look for it. And so I will leave it there, and I will save that. And now let's, okay, I'll run it. Before I even start, you notice last time it says, well, hey, we didn't get anything here, but now it says, hey, stage view, there's no data available, the pipeline has not been run yet. So let's build that. And let's look at the output, because we can actually see it running. We can see that it found the Jenkins file, it checked out the code, and then it gives us some kind of funky output here as far as the pipeline steps. um, but I think these are a little bit easier to see if we go back to the project and now look at the stage view. Because what we see here is we see the step here where we did the checkout. I have a step in there called prepare test environment, which you might, download some stuff, compile some stuff, etc. Check out some secrets or something like that. And then in the next step, you actually build your application, and then you run the tests on each browser. And then maybe you have some actions that you do after your test, where you email the report or compile the reports or something like that. Maybe also deploy your application or kick off some other job that deploys your application to wherever it's hosted. So that's just kind of a touch on how you can use a pipeline type environment in Jenkins with a source control management system. I did have another example that kind of ties to that. Basically, it gives you a different view, and I think if I go to my presentation, because I wasn't sure if I would have time for it, Jenkins has a new UI called Ocean Blue, where it basically gives you another view for your pipeline. So similar to what we saw where we had these different steps or whatever, this just gives you another kind of view of your pipeline. You can see what steps are running in parallel. If you get errors, it'll show you exactly which step of these parallel steps called errors. You can click into it. So it's a really kind of nifty way of drilling down to each step in the pipeline without having to look through logs or without having to go into one big step and kind of find out what happened in that particular part of the pipeline. So with that said, I know this has been kind of a whirlwind view of an introduction to Jenkins. I hope that you've taken something away from it, because Jenkins is ready to give you the world on a silver platter. All you got to do is install it, start running some jobs and playing around in the GUI, and before you know it, you're going to be automating things in this incredible framework that really just makes your job as a developer, a system administrator, a DevOps practitioner so much easier. So thank you so much for allowing me to share this with you, and I really appreciate it. Thanks. Are there any questions or any discussion? Standing
Can
by.
anybody hear me?
Now we can.
Oh, okay. I like because on my end it was like it wasn't doing anything. But we thank you for coming out, and it looks like it's still recording, but then it's like it's saying that I'm not connected, so I have no idea. But I think
All
there
good.
is a yeah, everybody's like great talk. If you do have questions too, there's booth time. Mike, I think some people